Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report. And I'm not even going to make the joke this time. There is a whole hell of a lot that has happened in these past 15 days. I apologize for the absence. Things have been busy, but I do have a show put together. I wanted to record this last night and have it out on Friday. I'm recording Friday night, for the record. But then the big news event, which I'll get into in just a moment, happened just as I was about to start recording. I was putting together the show notes, putting the final touches on them, and the biggest news event, arguably of the year so far, has taken place. But one thing I will address before we get into any news items is new channel art. And this is going to be the new thumbnail for the videos and for the show going forward. I had been meaning to change it for quite a while from the old one. I liked the old one, but I feel like with its setting, focusing particularly on the Syrian Civil War, or at least the previous phase of the Syrian Civil War, wasn't as relevant as it was and probably should have been changed a few years back. But there was nothing that was really to my liking. However, I came across this image, put my touches to it, of course, and this is a bit more timeless, a bit less specific, stuck in one moment. Of course, I'm sure it doesn't shock any of you. I like old maps. And I feel like this encompasses, now it doesn't have East Asia on it, but this encompasses most of the news that we talk about. And if I come across something else, I might try to find a map of, say, like the Far East in the same style for more, say, China-focused episodes, whatever that might be. But just let me know what you think. If you guys want me to go back to the old style, I'm fine with that. But I wanted to try something new, so I hope you guys like that. Without further ado, we have quite a bit to tackle over these past 15 days. And like I said, I'm going to go a little out of order today. I'm not going to slog through the Russian Ukraine stuff. I will cover Operation Spiderweb in the next segment here. But the stuff with Israel and Iran absolutely takes precedence. The lead up to this event was quite routine. It was on the evening of the 11th of June where you had U.S. Iranian talks up in the air, particularly regarding the nuclear agreement, where the U.S. submitted their proposal, no enriched uranium. The Iranians came with their counterproposal. Signs pointed to the Americans initially rejecting. However, they agreed to a sixth round of talks that were scheduled for next week, I believe. Needless to say, those are completely off the table, even though Trump is trying to revive them even after all this. And I'll read some of his statements in just a little bit here. After the fake out you had with the Israeli jets being scrambled on the 11th, in the evening of the 12th, which would have been the early morning hours of the 13th, local time, the strikes began. And they were massive waves. They were beyond what I figured the Israelis would be able to accomplish. Now, needless to say, these were strikes that were completely supported by the United States. Of course, at first, Rubio put out his statement saying that we weren't involved in this. Israel has the right to defend itself, and we'll diplomatically back our ally. The usual tripe that is put out after this kind of attack. And at the crack of dawn, we're talking 5:45 a.m., Trump comes out on Truth Social of all places and says that yes, the U.S. knew about the attack. We think it did a fantastic job. He didn't, at least as far as I know, directly implicate U.S. involvement in the attack. However, it was strongly hinted at, and given the scale of the attack, given what the Israelis were able to carry out, it could not have happened without American intelligence, American supply networks. It was simply off the table. American aircraft. They used F-35s in these attacks. So everything the Israelis did was contingent on American aid, and there were elements on the ground that, sure, you could say it was Israeli intelligence, you could say it was Mossad, but CIA, as well as other Western intelligence agencies, were likely involved in this. And I'll get into some of the brief details of the attack. Like I said, this is such a developing situation. I don't want to put too much down concretely. But a couple things I will mention before I get too deep into it is that there was a tentative deal in the works, and the Russians were helping broker it, at least according to the reports that were going around, and they were going outside of the International Atomic Energy Agency, who themselves gave justification for the strike by digging up almost 30-year-old documents about the Iranian nuclear program, which was a subtle hint that the Israelis were able to take action. But what it looked like right now is that the Russians were going to help facilitate these nuclear talks as part of the broader diplomatic rapprochement between Russia and the United States, which was already rocky, and given today's events, given yesterday's events, in my opinion, is completely off the table at this point. Diplomatic credibility is shot. What little was left of the Istanbul talks, and like I said, I won't get into those right now. The Americans are going to have no credibility at the negotiating table, especially after that, after Operation Spiderweb. But what did happen that apparently delayed the initial Israeli strikes that were set to take place on the 11th is that there was an ex CIA analyst who confessed to leaking documents. Now, he was given 37 months in prison, but he dumped them on a bunch of Telegram channels. And his name was Asif William Raham, age 34, pled guilty in January to 2 counts of willful retention and transmission of classified information after he was arrested for absconding with records from the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency last October that indicate Israel's plan to launch airstrikes in response to a massive Iranian missile attack. Raham, who had been a CIA employee since 2016, had access to top secret documents and leaked stolen information to Telegram channels, forcing Israel to delay its attack. So it does go back further, and this has been something that has been in the talks for months, that the Israelis were going to strike the reactors. Trump came in, he came in with the, I suppose you could say, illusion of a peace deal, illusion of negotiations, while the Israelis prepared their strikes. But what we're looking at with the overall situation before I get into the nitty gritty and talk about what might come of this is either A, the Israelis completely went against Trump, went against the United States, while still using their resources and intelligence to carry out this attack, thus making the Americans look impotent. Or B, they willfully participated and willfully provided these things to Israel, which they did, but they did so with the full assent of the United States president, which makes him look disingenuous as hell. All the kvetching about Trump for years and years about him being a liar, untrustworthy, blah, blah. I mean, yes, of course, he is a man who has made it this far in the world. He's going to be a complete cutthroat. But if Trump has truly earned the reputation of a bald-faced liar, it is this operation right here that did it. Uh, Completely stringing along the Iranians, and you could argue that maybe the Iranians were stringing us along, trying to bide time for their own plans. However, given somebody like Pezeshkian in power, and given the situation with Iran, I think they were willing to return to the 2015 status quo, which looked like was going to be the deal. It's just that they were going to slap Trump's name on it, and it was going to be the Iran deal too, except Trump did it better this time, which would have been, yes, admittedly a more favorable outcome, but also a waste of everyone's time because he tore up the deal in 2018. But now it's completely off the table, and there is no hope of reproach with the Iranians unless the regime collapses and there's somebody in there who just concedes to all of our demands. And we've reached a point where, because of these strikes and because of the Iranian retaliation, it becomes a matter of when rather than if the Americans are going to take action against Iran. Now, is this going to be a sustained war effort on our part? I doubt it. It might be similar to Syria in 2017 or 2018, where we lob some missiles at some targets and call it a day. It could be a little more intense at that, where we do target strategic assets, because as we saw, even though they did make some strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities. In fact, I'll pull up the map just to give an idea of where the Iranian facilities are. And hitting the facilities was not the only goal of this operation here, but we could have a more sustained U.S. campaign because the Americans would be more capable of being able to take out those reactors. They would have the armaments, they would have the logistics in order to do that, where the Israelis, even for the normal operations, they need heavy American support to do so. Or we could, yes, get the alternative where Trump is Mr. Peacemaker, as he touts himself, while completely subsidizing the Israeli war effort, which is going to call into question some things about Ukraine that I'll get into in a moment here. But something that was rather prescient that Witkoff was saying just a day before these strikes, he was speaking to a group of Republican senators about his progress on the deal with Iran, and he was warning that the Iranians do have rather robust missile and drone capabilities, and that if they were to strike against Israel, it would not be easily defensible. It would be something that would cause serious damage to Israel and would look like a substantial attack. Now, compared to, say, like the Houthis. Now, the Houthis have had quite, I don't know the word for it, surprising success for a group of its magnitude against the state of Israel, especially considering the state of the art air defenses they allegedly have in the terms of the Iron Dome and David Sling. Both of those names just make me cringe out of my skin, but I digress. Or, say, the much more primitive rockets of a group like Hamas, or something maybe a little bit more intermediary like Hezbollah and their rockets. Even those were getting through Israeli air defenses. Now, as it stands, Hezbollah has not actually gotten involved in this operation. And I would suspect, even though the organization is still functional, they are still in some disarray. They are not as organized as they once were after the Israeli cell phone attacks back last fall. And like I said, while it didn't destroy the organization, it has set them back quite a bit. And I think that was the goal of this Iranian operation, but as we've seen with the retaliation, Iran is not down for the count yet, and it is intense. I just had to pick a moment to start recording because the situation is just non-stop updates. It's like the beginning of Russia-Ukraine, where it was just second by second you're getting Telegram updates and new videos and new information. But returning to Witkoff's statement, he's somebody who I have admitted I have mixed feelings on, and especially on the Israel issue, he very much has his biases, and that is not any secret. But it does seem he has some strategic mind for the situation at hand, where he realized if this does escalate to direct fighting between the two countries, this very possibly is a result. And I do think that is something he wanted to avoid for a number of reasons. But it was completely disregarded by the Israelis and given the green light by the Americans. And one has to wonder at this point, is Lindsey Graham the national security advisor? That's what it feels like. I know as it stands now, Rubio is interim in that role ever since they removed Mike Waltz, who was removed from that role because of his alleged close ties to Israel, which makes you wonder if this entire spat between Trump and Netanyahu, between Trump and Israel, was staged. Or was this truly a battle of the egos, but when the chips were down, everyone knew the role they had to play? I think both are quite reasonably possible. I'll just put it that way. I don't think one is more likely than the other in that case. And I think this was a likely outcome. Even during the height of their feud, I don't think anyone could have honestly expected that Trump would throw Israel under the bus. It simply was not within his purview. It was something he was not going to do. And if he wanted to, the opportunity was right now, when they took brazen action in the region. Trump could have said, you're on your own. And he could have said, if you're going to continue to pick fights, we're not going to bail you out. There's not going to be any more arms shipments, any more intelligence sharing. He could have done the same thing with the Ukrainians, but yet here we are. And how much of this you can. I mean, Trump, yes, he's the man in charge, so he does deserve fault for this. He's not immune from criticism. I've praised the man in the past, but I'm just as willing to criticize him. And while my hopes were not high in the first place, he has managed to dash all of them. And frankly, this feels like a more intensified speed run of his entire first term. He was willing to back down, he was willing to back out with that. But I don't know, perhaps it's age, perhaps he feels some sense of urgency that he needs to accomplish all these things before he leaves office or dies. But he's more or less taking his talking points from Lindsey Graham and Mark Levin, who, of course, visited the White House just days before the Americans, unofficially, even though they'll deny it to the hilt, unofficially let Israel conduct this attack. And they'll say, oh, it was Israel's action, we're always going to support our greatest ally, whatever. No, it was a coordinated action. And I think it shows, even if we are to assume the best about Donald Trump, that continuity of policy is so strong within the United States, whether that be in regard to Eastern Europe or the Middle East or even some domestic issues. You look at the riots in LA, which, while I did want to cover, it's simply a secondary story to everything that's happened. I apologize if anyone's looking forward to that coverage. I might come back later when things have calmed down a little, or when I have the opportunity to talk more about some of the domestic news that's going on. And while there has been, say, a better response than the 2020 riots, the administration still balked. And immigration progress is woefully inadequate. You had his statement about, we need the farmers to have their migrant workers because of how dependent our economy is on it, while also at the same time bashing Biden for letting in 21 million illegals, which you could debate the numbers all day, but some people say it's A/B testing, some people say it's classic Trump. But no, this is a man who, if we're to assume the very best, and let's just do it for the sake of argument, is completely wedged in the continuity of the regime while putting his own flair on it. And something we've said on this program, me and GSP, unfortunately, he couldn't join us again because of the ongoing situation in his life right now. If there are two things that could destroy Trump's legacy, destroy Trump's second term, it's an economic crisis or a foreign policy crisis. Now, it looks like, although the economic situation is not great, it has stabilized. It's a bit of malaise. I guess that's the word for it, where it's everyone knows what's coming, but it's not intense. And we'll see what the spike in oil prices as a result of these attacks does to the U.S. economy. That could be catastrophic if this is not brought to order soon. Or a foreign policy crisis where, yes, Trump has been pro-Ukraine. Yes, Trump has continued to provide Ukraine with all the due aid and intelligence. But if Trump is officially or even unofficially co-signing this Israeli operation, which could go on for who knows how long at this point, then he is committing us to another, as the term would go, forever war, which is the exact opposite of what the voter base wanted. I don't think foreign policy was even one of the primary issues of this election. I think it was secondary just because of how intense situations around the world have gotten. But that was one of the things. We went through it on the Trump victory episode when we went through the exit polls. People who were primarily concerned about foreign policy issues thought that Donald Trump was going to be some return to normalcy. And I'll admit, I fell for that a little myself. I thought that, no, it's not going to be perfect. Yes, there's going to be some degree of continuity. There's going to be the aid trickling to Ukraine and Israel because that's simply where the empire has decided it wants to stake its claims. But I figured there'd at least be some sort of curtailment. Maybe some improvement of relations with Russia beyond some of the superficial aspects we got. perhaps a little bit less involvement in the Middle East, simply because it was not practical. But as it stands now, and things could change, but as it stands now, those hopes, those of us who may have had any degree of those hopes, it's been completely dashed. And there's really not much else you can say about it. So I'll get into the actual operation itself. So, of course, they named it Strength of Lion. That's the name of the Israeli operation, which can only make me think of India Lion Tusar. The Indians are going to go nuts about this. They're going to love it. And there were strikes in residential neighborhoods where IRGC commanders live, and also Iranian nuclear scientists. So far, the list of targets hit by Israel just in the first wave, and there were so many reports coming in, it was hard to keep up with all of them. So this is just a very abridged list of everything that they struck or attempted to strike. So there were assassinations of Hossein Salamai, who was an IRGC chief of staff, IRGC General Gholami Rashid, nuclear scientist Faruddin Abbasi, Mohammed Mehdi Taranchi, and Abdul Hamid Minochecher. They were scientists on the Iranian nuclear program. And there were attacks on Qataria, Niavran, West Tehran, and Chitgar, East Tehran, Mehrabad, which is where Iran's airport is. Iran's main airport is. Mahalati, Shahid Chamran, Tower in Kamraneh. These list right here is all places in Tehran. Sadat Abad, Endersgu, uh, Orchid Complex, Shahid Daegi Settlement, Ferazadi, the headquarters of the Armed Forces General Staff, uh, Ali Shakami's residence, and the Sadat Abad Square Teachers Complex on the borders of Tehran. Also, other targets included the Natanz nuclear site, the Parchin nuclear facilities, military bases in Tehran in Qum province, Khorramabad, Hamadan, Parchin, Qasr Shirin, Tabriz, Peranshar, Kermanshah, Ilam, and Arak heavy water facility. And the way this attack was conducted was rather reminiscent of Operation Spiderweb, which I'm sure many of you have heard the details of, and that I'm going to get into in a little bit myself here, where there was the conventional element of the attacks with missiles launched from jets, and I don't believe there were any launched from, say, any like stationary sites in Israel, but launched from jets, even launched from some Navy assets. But there were teams on the ground who had drones that were able, with close range, to overwhelm air defenses, and that during the first wave of the attack, the first two waves of the attacks actually going through the night into the morning, Iranian air defenses seemed completely paralyzed. And I think that was true to a degree. Once you had the third and fourth wave and the ongoing waves of attacks, it was a bit more evened out with that. You actually had Iranian air defenses responding right before their retaliation. But as we saw last year with the skirmishes, the Iranians have proven they are capable of striking deep into the heart of Israel. And that's what they did with what they called Operation True Promise 3, a follow up for Operation True Promise 2 and 1, which Operation True Promise was the one from, I believe, last October, and then the first one was the drone wave they had back in April when, after the Haniyeh assassination back last year, last spring, last summer. Uh, but just a brief overview of what the Iranians call Operation True Promise 3 is that in the operation, missile and drone units of the IRGC Aerospace Forces, using a combination of pinpoint and intelligence systems, targeted military centers and air bases that were the origin of the criminal attack against our country. This is, of course, a statement from Iranian officials, as well as the military centers that were used in the production of missiles and other military equipment and weapons used to commit crimes against the resistance of nations in the region, particularly the oppressed people of Palestine, Gaza, We target these locations along other military targets deep in the occupied territories. It goes on in response to the command of the Supreme Leader of the Islamic Revolution and Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces. Demands the noble people of Iran is in part the Islamic Republic of Iran's response to the shedding of innocent blood in our nation. The operation was carried out in coordination with all the armed forces of the Islamic Republic of Iran in an authoritative and aggressive manner. And its main message to the security of the Islamic Republic is the red line of the armed forces. So, very standard statement for what you'd expect in this kind of situation. But so far, it's been a complete barrage. And even after this attack, after the initial Israeli attacks, they were moving citizens into the bunkers. They were moving leadership into the bunkers. They were canceling normal, everyday activities, essential services only operating within, like I said, just hours of launching their attack. And I saw the airstrike alerts that come into Israel that, of course, all have the app on their phones because they live in a country where they constantly are at odds with all of their neighbors, which results in some skirmishing, it seems. And at a certain point, these alerts were just saying across the country, strikes expected across the country. And you had the wave of Iranian attacks coming in, first with the drones, and then with the ballistic missiles, and then they were actually employing what some alleged were some of the hypersonic missiles. And they hit targets near the mononuclear reactor. They hit several buildings in Tel Aviv, including the Ministry of Defense. They hit some residential areas, whether that was a strike against, say, what like the Israelis did, where they were trying to take out key figures, and strikes against other vital targets within Israel. And it was just a complete barrage on the Iranians' part, returning blow for blow. This was not just a symbolic strike back, and that the Iranians had said, contrary to what many of their statements have said, we're not exercising restraint. You have the UN rep calling what Israel did an act of war and effectively a declaration of war in Iran. And now you have two countries that are several hundred miles apart that are exchanging fire over the airspace of Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria. And it doesn't seem like there is any reprieve of the situation right now. When these strikes initially happened, many thought that this was a decapitation strike on the Iranian government, and it may very well have been, but it did not succeed. And there were people who pointed out that the intensity of the strikes right now, at least the first wave, even the first two waves, you want to be generous, compared to what you see in Russia and Ukraine, was really not that much. In that Iran has about more than twice the population of Ukraine, has a domestic military industry, and although they had massive security failures, they do have the capability to defend themselves. And while this was a complete security breach on every level, and that whoever was in charge of this has no business being in their jobs, just objectively speaking, looking at what happened, this is not enough to cripple Iran. And some might even argue that if they were targeting the top brass of the IRGC in the military, these are many of the ones who would constantly call for restraint. And somebody made an interesting comparison. This would be like if Russia would have decided to take out Syrski. Now, I don't know how much you guys want to co-sign that comparison, but I do think it's interesting. Where you have somebody who is really completely out of their element in that role, Syrski being head of Ukrainian armed forces, and that if you took him out, if he was KIA, he would probably be replaced by a much more competent and aggressive um, officer beneath him. And you could say that the same is true of the Iranian military and the IRGC, where you have a lot of these commanders who have been there since the Iranian Revolution, who, much like the political leadership in Iran, seem very ossified, very stuck in their ways, very immovable when times when action is demanded. And one could say the younger officers who would be promoted to replace them would be much more aggressive, and perhaps they're the ones calling the shots right now. We really don't know. But it does look like, just with a single stroke, the Israelis have crushed any anti-Islamic Republic sentiments that existed within Iran. Because we've talked about this before. Beyond the really obvious color revolution nonsense, there is some genuine discontent with the living situation in Iran. And a lot of people were losing faith and confidence in the regime, even if they weren't liberal women who got half naked. There were a lot of people, for economic, political, social reasons, were losing faith in the regime. But what the Israelis have done have been to create a massive rally around the flag effect, where even people who have nothing but contempt for the Islamic Republic are going to realize it is an us versus them situation. Our country is under attack. It is at war. Even though we despise the current government in power, bombs are dropping on our head, and we're going to be moved to action, because that's the point where you have massive rallies out in the street that were demanding retaliation almost immediately after these Israeli strikes, and they have retaliation. Some might argue that it was pressure from the populace that did lead the Iranian government to act. Now, I don't think it would go that far. I think a strike of this proportion warranted at least a proportionate response, similar to how you had with the Haniyeh assassination, similar to how you had with the other strikes between Israel and Iran that were admittedly against proxies. For example, when they hit the embassy complex in Damascus last year, and I think it had been shown time and time again, although the Iranians seemed hesitant, although they would always bide their time, their responses were usually proportionate. And we're seeing that once again right now. So, what a general overview of the Iranian strikes look like right now is, in general, the first wave was aimed at Tel Aviv, the second at Haifa in northern Israel, the third into southern Israel and Tel Aviv again, and targets that were struck or attempted to be struck were once again the Dimona nuclear site, the Ministry of Defense, Tel Nof and Nevatim air bases, the gas platforms off the coast of Gaza, and the sites in Haifa, as well as the financial center in the Ministry of the Economy, which I suppose is probably the most brutal strike to Israel. That's the one where it really hits them where it hurts. And there are, I'd hate to participate in the rumor mill, but there are rumors that an F-35 was downed in one of the Israeli waves. Now, like I said, I'm not going to speculate too much. There were some pretty convincing AI photos that, upon first glance, looked real, but when put to scrutiny, did not. Much like Operation Spiderweb, there were some convincing AI photos at first, but then, once actually put to scrutiny, simply did not hold up. But now, even as the fighting is intense as of this moment of recording, and whatever it looks like tomorrow morning, I couldn't say. By the time this episode actually releases, a lot of this could be bad or outdated information. What's next? Some are saying that this is a massive humiliation for Iran, and yes, the security failure that allowed, say, drone platforms to be deployed domestically against Iranian military assets, that was embarrassing. And that if the response didn't look like what it did or what it does right now, the Iranian government probably would have lost complete confidence, and they would have either been removed by force or fled the country or pressured to resign. That could have very well been the case if the Iranians did not have such a forceful response that has, let's be honest, drawn the ire of the United States. And it's just a matter of when rather than if this escalates into a confrontation between them. To what scale that confrontation will be And the nitty gritty details of that remain to be seen, but a confrontation will happen. I can guarantee you that. And I hate to say that. I don't want it to happen, but I can guarantee you that we are on that road now. Uh, Bridges have been thoroughly burned, figuratively and literally. And I can only hope that it is like Syria in 2018, where we just lob some missiles and call it a day, because that's the least that's going to happen. But I fear for the worst in a situation like this. And some might say this is a massive victory for Israel. And yes, it was an impressive operation, even with the immense amount of American support. But let's look at the almost immediate response that I brought up earlier, where the Israelis ran for the bunkers. And yeah, of course, you're going to run to the bunkers when you're under constant attack. But let's look at what kind of nation Israel is and its model for population growth and sustaining itself. Now, yes, it has a very internally high birth rate, and yes, it is a very cohesive, homogenous society. It also is a country that relies on enticing the diaspora to quote unquote come home and live either in Israel proper or live in the settlements. You'll see time again how many Jewish individuals from Brooklyn or whatever city in the world come to go live in the kibbutzes, in the settlements in the West Bank, or in Israel and sign up to fight with the IDF. In fact, there was actually an Israeli pilot that was downed over Iran, and it's speculated that it is a dual American-Israeli citizen, also a woman as well. So Israel, on top of everything else, also needs to be a constantly enticing presence for the Jewish diaspora. That is one of their key models to their growth and to their expansion, especially when it comes to population figures. The question is, after this, who wants to move to Israel? Israel's economy since October 7th has already been suffering, and it hasn't entered a recession, but Israel's economy has been stagnant. It has not been what you'd expect from a so-called first world technologically advanced nation. And you could attribute that to broader global trends. But a country that is constantly 1 inch away from war and now is in a war is not going to have the kind of investment or tech industry or these really heavy hitters that Israel loved to pride itself on 20 years ago. And as I was saying with, say, the diaspora immigrating, a lot of Israelis have other passports too. They could very well pick up and leave at any point. Now, right now, of course, flights are shut down out of Ben Gurion, but we saw this since October 7th, where, first off, you had 60,000 displaced people out of northern Israel because of the fear of a Hezbollah attack. And as it stands now, northern Israel is still quite, I don't want to say sparsely populated, but this population of 60,000 out of a nation of 8 or 9 million, by the way, just to put in perspective, I don't believe has returned to their homes in northern Israel. And if these strikes are going to be the norm, we could conceivably see a situation where many Israelis with the means to get out, whether they have family abroad or another passport or the money to just get out, are going to start fleeing. And I don't think that's a dramatic statement if this conflict intensifies. None of them are going to want to be there. And it could create an interesting reverse situation where they always tout Israel as the last safe haven if anything goes wrong in, the evil, evil Western countries. But we could see a reverse exodus where they do go to live in their penthouses in New York and London and Paris and Berlin and go down to their little retirement communities in Florida. Like I said, a lot of these people, tens if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Israelis, if we're being honest, do have an escape route. And many of them, after this, I do think will be taking that escape route. And you look at popularity among Israel, among the Jewish diaspora, it is taking a nosedive. In fact, you see a lot of those, um, once again, very left wing, admittedly, protests for the pro Palestinian movement. A lot of them are led by people who are of a Jewish background, but are decidedly on the left. And this isn't anything new. That you've had the ones who are more, let's just say, internationalist in their mindsets, and they don't want to abide by any ethno state, even if it is for the sake of their own people. Now, there's plenty who will make that key exception, but it is worth noting that among the diaspora, with how atomized they are, with how much they have assimilated into the urban blob, they're part of coastal American culture. They're part of the cosmopolitan culture of, say, any major Western city where it is just ingesting uh, your values and beliefs from New York and San Francisco. And that's what a lot of these people are like. And, I mean, frankly, you're more likely to see, in my opinion, a lot of these populations go resettle in, say, some of the more quote unquote traditional European countries. I know Orban, who I've praised in the past and still give him an immense amount of credit for everything he's done and everything he still does continue to do right. Uh, was just a few weeks ago meeting with Orban saying that Hungary is one of the safest countries in Europe for the Jewish population. So you could see a situation where those countries, or Poland with their new government with Nawrocki, even though they do have Tusk still in power as prime minister, they could court that and they could say, "We're sorry about all the historical atrocities that happened to you." I think there is a program where Jewish individuals can still claim land that was seized from them by the Germans during World War II, but ethnic Poles can't. So wrap your head around that one. But yeah, you could very reasonably see a possibility where that is the case. And then of course, placed in the United States is always going to be the base number two, as it were. The American empire is always going to be their fallback plan. I mean, you look at the population; it's like there's many Jewish individuals, whether that be practicing religious down to just ethnic, in the United States as there is the state of Israel. And Iran, while I do think it has been severely wounded, especially if the Israelis do target oil facilities that could very much harm their economy, that could create chaos in the global markets. But hey, they don't care. They have their means. They will always see themselves as the exception. We won't be affected by this. Blah 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 blah. But even with that, like I said, what these strikes have done, at least in my estimation of the situation as it's early in developing, has created a rally around the flag effect that has drawn in most dissidents, people who aren't outright willing to, say, participate in a war against their own country. That is who has been drawn in by this. And we could see a situation where, ironically enough, this war, if this does continue, if this does become a sustained campaign of weeks, if not months, if not years, of fire being exchanged back and forth between Israel and Iran, gives way to a new generation of leadership in Iran, especially among the military brass. And I will once again return to a point I've been making for years on the show. One of the main reasons I think Soleimani was assassinated is because of his political aspirations. Uh, they feared, Israel and of course all their assets feared a military strongman in charge of Iran instead of, say, one of these liberal or quote unquote liberal reformers like somebody like Pezeshkian, or one of these ossified, um, more clerical types. And I'm not saying that Iran needs to be, secular liberal and fly the rainbow flag, not by any means, but when you turn Islamic legalism into a principle of law, it does create a somewhat dysfunctional society. Now, I'm not saying Iran is dysfunctional, but it has its drawbacks, almost certainly. That it will um, get caught down in the nitty gritty of its own ideology, its own beliefs, as it were, where they very well could have had somebody who's a bit more secular, not in the, say, Western sense, more in the Middle Eastern sense, and more of a nationalist than a religious zealot. And there's probably plenty of people within the IRGC, within the regular Iranian military, who do meet that qualification. And as a result of this war, if the Iranians can hold on and not see their country turn into another Syria, Iraq, or Libya, we could see somebody of much more vitality and who is much more competent arise from this. And that's not even getting into the question of what is going to be the response from Russia and China. We could very well see, with the way the Russian arms industry is, they start pumping aid into Iran the same way the Americans pumped aid into Ukraine. And as it stands now, we've all seen the figures from the Ukraine war. The Russians have the advantage in the military industrial complex, and that even if Israel does want to sustain this operation, number one, it's going to divide American tension between Ukraine and Israel. So if we're to assume we're backing Israel to the hilt, Ukraine's going to be cut off, in which case I don't mean to laugh because it's not humorous, because although, yes, the war in Ukraine does need to end, and at this point, Ukraine is not a serious state, it is a failed state, it still is going to be a very dirty process no matter what way you cut it. That unfortunately a lot of people are going to die, a lot more people are going to be displaced when we're talking about Ukraine in particular, and that's not even getting into the situation in the Middle East. But if we're to assume that Israel is to carry on this campaign and that guaranteeing the security of Israel is going to be the number one foreign policy priority of the United States, then Ukraine is cut off. It's screwed. What are the Europeans going to? Are you going to have Peter Pavel with his armament plan, or is Friedrich Merz going to rebuild German industry in time to rebuild the Ukrainian military in order to charge against Russia? No, that's not going to happen. Even if we're going to assume that yes, Ukraine folds and takes, say, the summer 2024 Istanbul Accords that the Russians have put forward, even assuming that happens, which it won't. I do not foresee that happening at all. And the Europeans gear up for their next war against Russia, that's still going to take years. And then there's probably going to be pressure from Washington for, say, Germany, especially Germany, who owes so much to the Israeli state because of certain historical events that I won't get into right now. They need to send their tanks and their missiles. Israel needs those Taurus missiles. Listen, Zelensky, Netanyahu needs those. The Iranian terror regime threatens to destroy Israel. You can't have those Tauruses. We promised them to you. We were egged on that promise. But you know what? Israel gets those Tauruses. Israel gets the Storm Shadows. Israel gets the Scout missiles. We could very reasonably see a situation, if this does continue at the intensity which it does, where all those arms and armaments that were funneled to Ukraine are going to be yanked and going to be given right to Israel, in which case, given the nature of this war, is probably even more of a black hole. At least Ukraine shares a land border with Russia. At least Ukraine had some hope of fighting a conventional war. Had they, say, not gone on doomed offensives into Kursk or the 2023 offensive, there. Look, if Ukraine would have been planning more properly, I'm not saying they would have won, but they could have made this war much more difficult for Russia than it already has been. And that's not to downplay what Russia's went through in this war, the amount of casualties they've taken, the amount that they've invested in this war. Not by any means. But Israel is going to be even more of a black hole, because the Iranians have spent years developing their missiles programs, and the Israelis have sat on their laurels, being the most "quote unquote" most powerful country in the region that can always rely on the bailout of the United States. And sure, if the Israelis conduct, let's just say, the best strikes possible, if they do continue their so-called decapitation strike against Iran and the country completely collapses and some limp-wristed caretaker government comes in and accedes to every American and Israeli demand, Israel has still not solved the situation with the Arab states. You still have Saudi Arabia up in the air. And I don't think Saudi Arabia is going to, say, become the new hub of the so-called axis of resistance by any means. But even among these attacks, you still had Hamas conducting attacks on IDF positions during the wave of this. So you did get that. And Hezbollah, we're still waiting to see what Hezbollah is going to do. Where Israel's security situation is still up in the air, even if Iran falls, There's the looming question of what's going to happen with Turkey, what's going to happen with Syria. Is Israel still overextended on its home front? So even if if they win this engagement with the Iranians, long term their project is unsustainable, and they're either going to have to make severe concessions or collapse in on themselves. And it may not be my place to say, but what conclusion I personally feel at times is that we're either looking at the collapse of the state of Israel. It's not going to make it to age 80. That theory there, or yeah, we're getting close to the third temple. I think it's one of those two, and I really can't say which one it is going to be. I simply don't know. I don't have enough foresight to really say an outcome of that magnitude. But that very well could be what we're looking at. And I mean, we've said for years on this program that Israel is going to overextend itself, and this could be it. This could have been the last hurrah of Israel as a serious power, assuming they don't implement the Samson option. And with that being said, I think assuming enough of the facilities survived, which given the amount of underground facilities they had for their enrichment programs, for their nuclear programs, the Iranians, if the program is not destroyed, which does risk, of course, further and stronger U.S. intervention, they're going to get the nukes. They're going to build the bombs. Because, as we've seen with North Korea, that is the only way to prevent this. Gaddafi gave up his WMDs, gone. Saddam gave up his WMDs, gone. Assad gave up his WMDs, gone. North Korea, the Kim family, they didn't. And they're still there. Iran, they have every reason at this point, from their perspective, they have every reason to flaunt the non-proliferation treaty and build an arsenal to match Israel's. In which case, the situation either becomes a cold peace with mutually assured destruction, or the Israelis lash out and launch preemptive strikes, which we see the first use of nuclear weapons since 1945. And I fear if any country were to do it, it would be Israel. But we should move on to news out of Ukraine. And I'm just going to breeze through the frontline updates because while progress has been made, it isn't the main focus of our Ukraine-Russia news today. So in the direction of Novopavlovka, you have had Orehovo fall to Russia, and Russia has made its first crossing into the Dnipropetrovsk border, as well as fighting in Komar. Near Kupiansk, you have fighting near Figolivka, Malashipivka, and Radkovka, or Shipkivka, excuse me. And Russia advances towards Uchevnaya and Dolagkone. Pokrovsk direction, you have ongoing fighting near Zhirove, advances near Udachnoye and Moravka, and as well as Novomikhailivka or Novonikolaevka. And Mirnograd, you have fighting on going near Rusinyar, Poltavka, and advances by Russia in Katerinovka, Koptevo, and Alexandrovo Kalinovo. Sumy is probably the most substantial part of the front line right now. And that is the Russians have secured the high ground to the north of Sumy City, which puts them in the so-called death box, where Russian artillery has complete reign over the city, and one could say this is leading up to an operation of Sumy, of actually taking the city. But even if they opt against, because that would be the largest target at that point that they would take on, but even if they were to opt against that, it would still draw forces from the fragile Donbass fronts, and really force the Ukrainians to pick and choose where they want to mount their defenses with their dwindling resources. And I mean, I know it's a different front, but Pokrovsk, this is what this all hinges on. But it looks like Sumy and the increasing incursions into Kharkiv, on top of the massive strikes in that followed and that were in response to Operation Spiderweb, it becomes a more and more dire situation in Ukraine as a whole, but going back to Sumy in particular, you had the Russians striking SBU headquarters in Sumy as well as launching missile strikes on the security service of Ukraine. And there were photos of the strike that were published by local media. And once again, I try not to show too many photos because of copyright and other concerns. And according to Ukrainian media, there are many wounded men, uh, and they were about 30 years or older. And at the same time as this strike, there were other strikes in downtown Sumy, but they're not really sure what the target was because it just hit the street. Uh, but the main target for that strike into the heart of Sumy was the SBU headquarters. And Sumy is one of the interesting ones because it's one of those places with the divided loyalties with ethnic Ukrainians and ethnic Russians, where you look at the data on the province, or the oblast, I should say, before the outbreak of the war, it was one of those ones that was majority Surzhyk speaking, where they spoke the pidgin language between Russian and Ukrainian. Uh, Identification with ethnic Russian or ethnic Ukrainian went back and forth. There were plenty of people who spoke Russian as a first tongue and identified that way as well. And to my understanding, in some of the more provincial areas, the Ukrainian nationalist narrative has taken more root, where they do see themselves as the more core Ukrainians versus, say, the ones that are closer to Russia. And that being said, there are still plenty of Russian sympathizers across Ukraine. It's just hard for them to come out and openly say it at this point. But I don't think war aims for Russia would indicate that Sumy is on the table. I frankly see them. I think it'd be more likely for them to take Chernigov, which I know isn't an active front right now, but in terms of population makeup, at least to my understanding, I think Chernigov would probably be a bit more favorable to, say, integration of the Russian Federation, or a more, I guess you could say, pro-Russian position in the first place. But moving on to the big news out of Ukraine the past couple weeks, that would be Operation Spiderweb, which I'm sure you've all heard plenty about. And we can litigate the aircraft numbers and go on all day. Yes, it was an embarrassing strike for Russia. This was 18 months in the works. And these strikes came from within Russia, striking everywhere from 5 targets from Murmansk to near Vladivostok, where Ukrainian nationals who went through and got Russian documents, whether legitimately or otherwise, registered these shell corporations where they built these drones, hired moving companies to drive them to the location, and then remotely activated them. So, much like you had with some of the Kirchberg's attacks, they recruited unwitting drivers, and I mean, it's a real possibility given some of the situations in Russia that these were some migrant workers from Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan who maybe didn't speak the best Russian, were just there, maybe overstaying their visa. People had really no business being in the country, and certainly not any business hauling any uh, material near any sort of military installation. And they activated the attacks. Now, the big question is with that: did Trump approve of this? What was the American role in this? And like I said, you can go through. The Ukrainians said, "Oh, we hit the 40 Russian bombers." I mean, you went through that. Yes, there were damaged aircraft. There were some that were repairable. Like I said, the numbers are still a bit fuzzy, even a couple weeks onward. So I don't want to put exact numbers to it. But point being is, just even days after the strikes, the Russians had the Tu-95 bombers, which was the big Ukrainian accomplishment. That's the one that they claimed they just completely grounded the entire air fleet, if you were to take the Ukrainian narrative at face value. they had those in the air striking targets at the Ukrainians just within a matter of days. And what I found entertaining, or humorous, I should say, is that many pro Ukraine people were, without any hint of irony, calling this Russia's Pearl Harbor, thinking that it would end well for Ukraine in that case. That a massive attack on Russian military hardware and Russian military bases, which, I mean, this is far from the first time. I mean, this is the most extensive operation, like I said. It was 18 months in the works. And now seeing what we've seen in Iran, these were almost identical operations, it seems, especially with building the drones behind enemy lines and launching them from there. And it also does show a pretty profound security failure in both. I would say in the case of Iran, a bit more of a security failure. But ultimately, beyond the initial PR high, it reinvigorated some of the pro-Ukraine talking points. But then we saw, once again, the continued offensives in Sumy in particular, and across the front line, and the Russian response to it, which was a barrage of missiles and drones across the country. Now, this isn't anything new. Like I said, the Russian Ministry of Defense actually said that the waves of attacks that came out afterwards were pre-planned and that they really had nothing to uh, do with any of it, or that wasn't a response that the response would be coming. But what I think is frankly more egregious, that I think has been overlooked, is that attack on the train in Bryansk and the attack on civilian targets in Kursk once again. But as it stands, according to the Atlantic, Trump was very disappointed with this, and he saw it as something that stifled peace talks, which he, of course, has prided himself on, even though it looks like those are more or less dead in the water at this point. And I'll get into the clown show with the body exchanges, because that was just pathetic on Ukraine's part. But in Bryansk, there was a train attack that killed 7 civilians, some of which were, to my understanding, very young children as well. And among the Russian populace, that caused more outrage than the attacks on any of the air bases or any of the bomber sites. Which, once again, that also brings into question some implications about the START treaty. Which, don't worry, I'll get into that in just a minute. But Putin's put out a statement, in particular, responding to the attacks against Kursk and Bryansk, saying that Russia fears the illegitimate regime in Kiev is turning into a terrorist organization, are being confirmed by strikes on civilians. Kiev sponsors are accomplices of terrorists. Ukraine does not want peace. Power is more important to those in Kiev than their people. In the face of enormous losses on the front, Kiev has turned to terror tactics. Ukrainians are disrupting negotiations and exerting terrorist pressure on Russia, demanding a ceasefire. The AFU are suffering defeats in the battlefield. They have suffered huge losses in the Kursk Oblast. Upon Kiev's request, a high-level meeting, quote, upon Kiev's request for a high-level meeting, the response was, what is there to talk about in these conditions? Who negotiates with terrorists at all? If there's a pause in fighting, it will be used for pumping Kiev with weapons, continuing violent mobilization, preparing for terrorist attacks. And the Kiev authorities lack even basic political culture, allowing themselves direct insults towards those who they should be trying to negotiate with. And of course, the well wishes to those injured and the families of the victims in Bryansk and Kursk, and the quote unquote necessary measures needed to assist them. And many were saying after the initial attacks that Putin can't be taken seriously. He's too weak-willed as a leader. The Russians need to up their responses if the Ukrainians are going to attack Russia's strategic arms capabilities, which we had this happen before, with them attacking the early warning system with drones. I believe that was in 2023 or 2024. But it does look like, and look, I'm not here to run cover for Putin. I'm not here to run cover for any politician, whether in my country or anywhere else. But I do think it is a bit of a one-dimensional view of the situation on the ground, and that as it stands, yes, Ukraine is strategically losing this war. They can lash out, they can launch these strikes, they can do whatever, really, but at the end of the day, it's not going to reverse the situation on the front line. And what this just looks like now is that they're taking down as many Russians as they can with them before they ultimately collapse. And some might argue that is to quote unquote soften them up for the next phase of the war if the Europeans were to get involved. Now, just to put some perspective on this, and also something I did forget to mention just before, around the same time as Operation Spiderweb, as these drone attacks, there were massive power outages throughout Novorossiya, particularly in Zaporozhye and Kherson in the south, where the Ukrainians managed to cut power to those temporarily. Now, of course, it's been restored since. But just some perspective. Now, these figures come from Scott from Calibrated, who I think generally does a good job. Some might say he's a bit too eager to jump the gun on some of these things, but like I said, for the sake of the point I'm trying to prove, I think these numbers get the point across. I think that it's important to keep this in mind. When you had this super secret 18 months in the planning operation, over the course of that week, from the 26th to the 31st of May, the Russians gained 214.5 square kilometers. And just the day of the attacks, which would have been the first weekend of June, the Russians gained 24 square kilometers alone. So, regardless of the unconventional tactics that the Ukrainians resorted to and will continue to resort to, it's not reversing their situation strategically. It's not reversing their situation on the front line. And in terms of Ukraine's other, I guess you could say, irregular attacks, you also had yet another attempt at the Kerch Bridge. And this time it wasn't a patsy truck driver who they fooled into smuggling deadly cargo across the bridge before detonating the truck. This was just a simple drone swarm, in which case you saw traffic restored the same day, within, I think, 12 hours, as it were. But it has gotten to the point where truck drivers in Stavropol, which is right on the other side of the Kerch Strait into mainland Russia, are refusing to transport cargo without first verifying what's inside. And this is in response to the previous use of truck drivers to attack the Kerch Bridge, and also in response to the recent operation where they hid drones in the truck, and that trucks are now losing hours at security checkpoints, and that it is slowing down traffic because of the irregular tactics the Ukrainians have resorted to. Um, the highway between Chita and Khabarovsk in the Amur region, where one of the trucks didn't make it to its target and exploded prematurely and launched prematurely. That was cleared out. The Kaluga region had volunteers, Cossacks, Rangers, Hunters, and district administrators being recruited to guard bridges, administrative buildings, and regional borders. Truck inspections have also stepped up. And the Oryol region, starting almost shortly afterwards, additional posts were set up with entrances to all the regions. In Tula, which is the site really famous for Russian arms manufacturing, bridges and overpasses were inspected, CCTV cameras were being checked, and the Ministry of Transportation, Police, and Russian National Guard were deployed to additional patrols at bus stations. And the Ukrainian UAVs that were targeting the Ukraina Air Base, or the Ukrainka Air Base, and the Amur region, and that was the attack that was prevented, but the driver was injured. And that stopped traffic on the 1428th kilometer to the 1439th kilometer of that road section in the Shershki district, and cars were being sent on a detour. So, really, aside from the outright attacks on civilians, what they did is they caused minor inconvenience to the Russians and some embarrassment. Now, some were wondering why the bombers were left out in the open, why this attack was so easy to conduct in that place. Well, that goes back to the provisions from the START treaty, and or the new START treaty, which is set to expire, I believe, in 2030. It's coming up here in the next few years. Although the Russians did suspend their participation in 2023, however, still remained a signatory of the treaty. But part of that was having strategic weapons visible by satellite in order to prevent any preemptive strike by one side or another. And some speculate that the reason that these airfields had their bombers out in the open was to hold to that. And if that truly is the case, and this wasn't just the Russians not taking proper security precautions, then once again, with the American participation in involvement organizing this attack, unless something seriously changes in the next few years here, they've shot their credibility to negotiate any arms treaty, any strategic arms treaty. Unless they come up with some unforeseen massive leverage against the Russians or really come to their senses, you could start to see a lot of the arms treaties that we've negotiated over the decades since the 1970s start to come apart and trigger a new nuclear arms race, which I don't think is a position anyone wants to be in. And already the Russians have put much more time and effort and money into keeping their arsenals modernized, at least staying ostensibly within the purviews of the treaty, while the Americans have allowed our strategic deterrence to ossify. And while one could argue the world would be a better place without nuclear weapons because they are just a ticking time bomb, quite literally, waiting for destruction, even and as we've been seeing in the past couple of years at least, especially, they don't exactly prevent wars now, do they? At least not in the sense that some might think. It might stave off some wars, but we could see a case where, yeah, we do engage in yet another arms race with the Russians, and in my opinion, this is going to sound like maybe a little bit of a bleeding heart take. There's no winners in that. Nobody comes out on top of that. It is disastrous for everyone involved. Now, moving on to some of my last pieces of Ukraine news, I think the other big story that had been overlooked during all of this is the body exchanges, which at one of the rounds of peace talks were agreed that there would be a 6,000 for 6,000 swap of bodies. So Medensky, who is the Russian peace envoy, said that certain sections of the front line will enter into a temporary ceasefire lasting 2 to 3 days, so both sides can collect the body of fallen soldiers, the 6,000 for 6,000 exchange. Medensky said he's in for an all exchange of the wounded and ill soldiers, and said that Russia will begin returning Ukrainian children back to Ukraine once their parents are identified and found, in reference to the alleged 40,000 children the Russians had kidnapped from Ukraine, many of whom were in the Donbass, who were reunited with family within Russia. And once again, they're saying that, hey, if you can prove that you have parents in Ukraine with a missing child that is in Russia, we will return them. And that, to quote Medensky, all families will be reunited. It's a matter of honor. And the Russians, as a result of this, had set up a DNA identification service for those who are missing relatives, that they'll be able to submit DNA records to an impartial organization which will match it up using data provided by the Russian side for the bodies of the fallen. And the Ukrainians kept the Russians waiting. They eventually did collect the bodies, but they kept the Russians waiting. And one of the big reasons for speculation about this is that Ukraine would owe something to the tune of 2.2 billion USD to the fallen families, given the promises of compensation for the families of those who died in the war, and that they would be liable for $2.2 billion paid out to those families. And also, you have the problem that you had actually in Afghanistan, of all places, of the so-called Ghost Army, where commanders do not want to report their lost men because they still collect their paychecks, they still collect their equipment, they still get more resources allocated to the men under their command if it shows that they don't have that many casualties. And it's a complete embezzlement scheme. Like I said, you can see this in third world armies all the time, and this does seem to be happening in Ukraine as well. And many of the body exchanges, although, as Medensky said, love him or hate him, he is correct. It is a matter of honor. It is. I hate to invoke the phrase because it has been so beaten to the ground. It is a matter of basic human decency uh, to have this exchange. Like even in World War One and World War Two, we're talking some of the bloodiest wars in history. They still had those moments of peace to exchange the bodies of the fallen and prisoners, so they could lay them to rest properly, and so they could really reunite their men and their families in one way or another. And at this point, when it comes to Russian-Ukrainian negotiations, it only gets worse. But before I get into that, I'll just cover the last couple items relating to Ukraine in particular, and that is you've had more anti-TCC partisan actions in Ukraine. For those of you who don't remember, the TCC is the conscription organization in Ukraine where Colonel Oleg Noborovsky of the TCC was killed in a car bomb in Odessa, and that in Uzhgorod, in the far west of Ukraine, we're talking in Zakarpattia or Transcarpathia, if you prefer, uh, you had once again yet another drive of conscription. And mind you, that although according to census records, a lot of these people are Ukrainian, this is the heart of the Russian population. This is the heart of the Hungarian population in Ukraine as well. So there still are ethnically biased conscription efforts of people who are not of the quote unquote core Ukrainian ethnicity. But this is one of many actions against the TCC who are only getting more brutal in their conscription efforts. And finally, I suppose some good news out of Ukraine is that the German coalition, upon pressure from opposition parties, backed out of their promise to provide Taurus missiles to Ukraine, and that Merz was forced to take that L and move on with the situation. But moving more into the Russian terms for peace talks that were put out by Medensky at the most recent round of negotiations, the draft memorandum had these points. For ending the war, Ukraine must legally recognize Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson as Russian territory, observe complete military neutrality and not join any blocs, downsize the Ukrainian military with limits on both personnel and weaponry, disband nationalist military and paramilitary units, give the Russian language official status, protection, rights, liberties, and interests of the Russian population, outlaw all what they would refer to as Nazi organizations, lift all restrictions on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and lift all mutual sanctions. That's for an end to hostilities and end to the war, but for an immediate ceasefire, Ukraine must begin withdrawing all its forces from Russian territory, including Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. Stop all mobilization efforts and begin demobilization. Stop all foreign military aid. Remove all third country military personnel from its territory and rescind martial law. And schedule parliamentary and presidential elections no less than 100 days after the end of said martial law. Those are the Russian demands on the table, and I think in many ways they know that those are not going to be accepted. And Ukraine's demands remain much the same, where uh, we must have an immediate ceasefire. We must freeze along the line of contact. The Ukrainians more or less parroting what Keith Kellogg gave them, and that we can work it out. Is really the document put forward by Kellogg, given to the Ukrainians to present as their own. Now, I suppose I should move on to, let's see, in my notes I titled this section Buffoonery, and this is just some general European news that I wanted to wrap up before I close out the show. And I have that, and I have a few East Asian news items. But probably the biggest news of the week, even bigger than Operation Spiderweb or the attacks on Iran, is that Annalena Baerbock, the former foreign minister of Germany, has managed to fail her way upward into president of the UN General Assembly. Now, that's not the General Secretary, that's just the president of the General Assembly. But hey, she may be on her track to replace Gutierrez at the end of his term at this rate. There were more talks about European sanctions against Russia, and it does look like there are some cracks in some of the more extreme measures, coming particularly from France and Belgium, who are refusing to back a Russian gas ban. And they're two of the top buyers of Russian LNG, and they're not going to, of course, back this ban out of course, of self-interest. And they're starting to express some doubts about the EU free from Russian gas by 2027 plan. France's Total Energies was locked into a deal with Russia's Novatek until 2032 and has a 20% stake in the Yamal LNG project. Belgium was also set to continue receiving Russian LNG through 2035 and wants the EU Commission to show exactly what the impact would be. And that those comments came from the Belgian Minister of Energy, Matthew Behet, speaking to European media outlets. Hungary and Slovakia, of course, have been completely on board with this, and that Orban says the plan is a disaster and should be stopped by quote unquote all means. Robert Fico refers to it as complete economic self sabotage, and the effects of this would be just sky high energy costs, which would drive up the cost of everything and further increase the economic and inflation crisis going on in Europe. Now for some news around NATO. Mark Rutte, the new General Secretary, is having some delusions of grandeur, where he is saying NATO is more powerful than Roman or the Napoleonic Empire. Uh, he says as Europe is probably in the most dire straits it's been, arguably in centuries, if you want to be completely honest about this. Europe is completely under the thumb of a foreign power. They're completely demilitarized. Their economies are falling into less and less functionality. You have a recession looming on the continent. They're cooking the books to 0.1% growth to make it look like they're avoiding a recession. And on the other hand, they're demanding more and more spending for GDP. That they want member states to meet beyond the 2% that they're treaty bound to meet, that very few actually did meet. But Rutte wants NATO states to up defense spending to 5% of GDP, which, coming once again from Fico, he rejected, saying, if anyone thinks we'll jump to 2 to 5% overnight, forget it. It's impossible. And as time goes on, not that I think many people, especially listening to this program, would have been fooled by it in the first place, the idea of NATO as a defensive pact and not a meat shield is coming apart at the seams. Many of these countries joined NATO for the economic benefits of it, particularly the, I guess what at one point we would have called the Visegrad countries, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, where some may have said, oh, it's because they're historical grievances, in the event of a resurgent Russia, they want a security umbrella. But no, it drew in Western investment, which does seem to be trickling away as time goes on and as resources are pulled out. And I'll get into some of that when I talk about some of the news out of Poland here. But NATO became a program for the countries joining for their own protection to be the meat shield in the event of the big war. And I do think more people are starting to realize that, at least coming from, say, somebody like Fico or Orban, whatever their faults might be. I think they do realize that the vision of NATO they were sold is simply non-existent. Now, I don't think either of them will ever contemplate leaving NATO. It's just become part of the status quo at that point. But I do think they expressed their skepticism quite clearly. But moving on to, say, the opposite point of view, as I had mentioned earlier, Petr Pavel, the president of the Czech Republic, has continued on with his campaign for the rearmament of Ukraine, where the Czech Industrial and Technological Holding the Czechoslovak group has announced the final stage of construction for a line of 155mm artillery shells in Ukraine. It was stated the plant would be located in an area of low risk of missile strike, which would ensure stable and uninterrupted production in the future. And just for context, in October 2024, the Ukrainian Armored Vehicles Company received a license from the CSG, the Czechoslovak group, to produce tank shells, and in December 2024, licensed to produce NATO artillery shells. Which is insane to think that patent laws and rights to manufacture something in wartime is one of the concerns, but here we are. And that includes 155 millimeter M107 rounds, 155 millimeter L15 high powered rounds, long range artillery rounds for the HE, BT slash BB, MKM slash VMT systems, 105 millimeter high explosive fragmentation artillery shells for the M1HE, and 120 millimeter tank shot. And this effort has united more than 100 companies from across the world, from the Czech Republic and Slovakia, also in Serbia, which you recall Vucic had his controversy with arms shipments ending up in Ukraine, Spain, Italy, the USA, Great Britain, and who could forget India. And according to information from May 2025, the owner of the holding, 32-year-old Michael Strand, has become the richest person in the Czech Republic and Eastern Europe with a net worth of 17.1 billion USD. And as it stands now, I don't think that Pavel's grand rearmament strategy for Ukraine is going to work. This does seem like just typical financial corruption, that the money is going to somebody's coffers, like that Michael Strand character, and regardless, it's not going to save Ukraine. And even if they were to produce to the level that the Ukrainians would need, it's simply too late for that. That ship has already sailed. Uh, but the last piece of NATO news I'll give you, at least directly, is that Kazakhstan and the UK have signed a military cooperation plan. And this took place in London, with the Ministry of Defense from Kazakhstan, led by the head of the department, arrived for an official visit. And they agreed to quote-unquote bilateral military cooperation, promising areas of interaction, and discuss that. And mind you, Kazakhstan is a CSTO nation that is ostensibly supposed to be an ally of Russia. Now, Kazakhstan has spent a number of years playing both sides of this, and it is concerning because they almost did have a color revolution. And now that they're signing bilateral pacts with perfidious Albion of all nations, this could present a problem further down the road. And after Ukraine is resolved, I would say that Russia's number one foreign policy priority for their own interest would have to be securing their interests in Kazakhstan, if not all of Central Asia. And that Kazakhstan is too big to lose, like they lost Ukraine. I'm not saying the situations are one for one. I'm not saying they're analogous. But if the Russians are concerned about Western influence, Kazakhstan needs to be the next thing that they address. I'm not even saying militarily, but it does need to become a priority. They do need to double down on their agreements there. They do need to double down on really curtailing Western influence in the country. To move on to Poland, because there's been some interesting news out of Poland lately. Starting with the presidential election, Nawrocki, who was the right-wing candidate, won a pretty comfortable victory. And the way I see this, I can't remember the name of his opponent, the just EU center establishment stooge that one would expect. Of course, Gregor Braun didn't make it to the second round. He didn't really breach that much of the vote, unfortunately. He would have been very entertaining as president of Poland. But barring that, there was no hope of Poland going in any different direction fundamentally. But what I do think is highlighted is Nawrocki's win and the return of the more right-wing faction. Of course, he is succeeding Duda, who reached his term limit. Is that it looks like a battle of direct influence of Washington versus influence of the European Union within Poland. And evidence for that is, according to reports, Macron was very displeased with Navrozi winning, and in his statement upon his quote unquote congratulation, he was pledging to build a quote unquote stronger Europe and quote unquote respect the rule of law, which were some not so subtle jabs at Navrozi's program, returning to, like I said, just sort of this standard establishment conservative position where they're renegades against the EU until it's time for EU foreign policy, in which case it resembles Italy with, say, Maloney. I think is probably the best example you could give for that. And of course, he's going to be more friendly with Washington. But I do think there was an interesting thing that happened in light of this, and now in light of the ongoing conflict in the Middle East, this is probably going to be doubly true, where the U.S. is beginning to withdraw military personnel and equipment from the Rezhov Yasinoka Airport. And this is the report from U.S. Army Europe and Africa, a press release from Yanisionka, Poland. The United States Army Europe and Africa announced the plans for the repositioning of U.S. military equipment and personnel from Yanisoka, Poland to other sites in the country. This transition is part of a broader strategy to optimize U.S. military operations, improving the level of support to allies and partners, while also enhancing efficiency. The decision to reposition troops and equipment reflects the months of assessment and planning, coordinated closely with Polish hosts and NATO allies. The important work of the facility was to provide military aid to Ukraine via Yanisoka will continue under Polish and NATO leadership, supported by a streamlined U.S. military footprint. Poland and its allies maintain robust protective infrastructure around this critical site. In 2022, U.S. forces established a temporary presence in Yanisonka after the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The site is not a permanent Polish military base, but has been utilized by U.S., NATO, and partners for 3 years. In the meantime, the U.S. Army has established U.S. Army garrison Poland and more robust facilities based on host nation agreements and significant level of investments in those facilities for both the Polish and U.S. interests. So, of course, U.S. forces are not withdrawing from Poland wholesale, but when it comes to the Rezhov Yanisonka base, it was primarily to provide aid to Ukraine, and the U.S. is handing that over. As they said, they're streamlining support where it's still going to come in the background, but the face of support from Ukraine out of Poland is now European. It's now NATO. But speaking of Poland and Ukraine, one of Navrozi's first acts in office was interesting because he decided to relitigate the Volyn massacre. For those of you who are not in the know about that or may have forgotten, the Volyn massacre was the massacre that took place in World War II in Galicia and Volyn, where the OUN, the organization, the Ukrainian Nationalist Organization, committed probably one of the most brutal massacres of the 1940s against ethnic Poles and those who they perceived to be traitorous Ukrainians. Those, say, for example, intermarried with the Poles or who didn't co-sign everything the OUN did, as well as ethnic Russians, Jews, and any other ethnic minorities. I think even like some Slovaks, but point being, like anyone who was not co-signed to the OUN position was completely massacred. And the reports are harrowing of that, and if you want to go into further detail, you can find plenty of resources about that. I don't feel comfortable repeating some of that stuff on the air. But Poland did declare the 11th of June a national Memorial Day every year for the Volyn massacre, and that was really the first action that came with Navrotsky winning the election. I'm not sure when he assumes office as president, but the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry put out quite an interesting statement. Let me just pull it here. And to read the statement from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, The MFA of Ukraine considers the decision of the Sejm of the Republic of Poland to establish the 11th of July, excuse me, 11th of July, I misspoke, it said 11th of June, as a day of remembrance for the victims of the so-called genocide committed by the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army in the eastern territories of the Second Polish Republic, to fly in the face of the spirit of good neighborly relations between Ukraine and Poland. So, unlike any other country that can genuflect and say, oh, yes, we did some terrible things in the past, the Ukrainian foreign ministry has to double down against one of its most key allies in this war and denounce the Poles for really having some sense of national interest. And perhaps this is a way, I mean, yes, it is politically charged on Poland's part. Many of these days of remembrance are politically charged on the part of any given nation. And perhaps it is a way for Poland to distance itself from the conflict as Ukraine starts to implode. But there's the concept of an unforced error. I'm sure you've all heard. And what much of Ukraine does is unforced errors, but this especially. They had nothing to gain by putting out the statement. They had nothing to lose by not putting out the statement. Yet they did anyway, out of just really what can only be described as petty nationalism. And really, I don't know what else to say other than this nation has really sown the seeds of its own destruction. And at this rate, I would be more than happy to see Poland take back all of the eastern territory that they lost after World War II. I'd be more than glad to see them take back Galicia at this rate, and because really, why should any nation have to abide by that with this basket case that's neighbor? Think what you will about Poland, but no country should have to abide by the basket case of Ukraine behaving like it does when you're its neighbor. And it's really that simple. Some other European news. Orban gave a statement that toes the line. I can only suspect he is under some degree of pressure because it did stick to his general messaging, but his tone did change a bit. So let me just read the statement here. A solution to the Ukraine conflict will be part of a major deal with Moscow and Washington, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban said. The direct quote is, "It's not right to think that a peace agreement and ceasefire will be the result of Russia-Ukraine talks. It's never going to happen. This is not where peace will come from. Peace and ceasefire can only happen as a result of U.S.-Russian negotiations." He continued on to say, Ukrainians aren't strong enough to make a deal with Russia that would end the conflict, Orban noted. In his view, even though European Union would continue to provide military assistance to Kiev, Moscow would still have an advantage on the battlefield. And he was also saying that uh, they would have to negotiate from a position of strength. They'd have because the Russians only quote unquote understand force. It sounded like something that would have come out of, say, like Keith Kellogg's mouth, where ostensibly on the side of peace, but really perpetuating the same narratives. Now, I don't think this is going to mark any sort of change in Hungarian policy towards Ukraine. I think a lot of those bridges have been burned, and they're not going to be rebuilt anytime soon. But there probably is some pressure from Washington and/or Brussels for Orban to toe the line for him to implement some of that more rhetoric, or perhaps he could be pandering to some of the more anti-Russian narratives domestically within Hungary, because out of all of the former Eastern Bloc countries, I would say Hungary probably has some of the most divided opinion on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where a lot of them are very instinctually anti-Russia for a number of historical reasons and want to back Ukraine because of that, whereas some are a bit more pragmatic about it, and some even have some sympathies with the Russians because of Hungary's own history with Ukraine, and I suppose enemy of my enemy, as it were. Vucic continues to act like a clown in Serbia, where he, after the scandal came out, said he would make sure that Serbia would not be exporting arms to Ukraine, even by third party, but also topped his statement off in a meeting with Zelensky in, I think it was some sort of southeastern European heads of state gathering, where he wanted to invest in Donbass reconstruction after the end of the war. I guess I'll need to speak to the Russians about that because I don't think the Ukrainians are holding on to Donbass by the end of this war. But a couple of the final European news I have is that Bulgaria has capitulated to the Eurozone, which is just going to be an eroding of sovereignty in a country that was a bit on the fence about supporting Russia. I'm sorry, you're supporting Ukraine. A bit on the fence about, say, the most rabid anti-Russia position, where once again, as a very mixed opinion population, where some of them are very pro-Russian, some of them, for whatever reason, hold historic grievances against Russia, even though compared to a lot of the other Eastern European states, Bulgaria, its reasoning is a bit more flimsy on that. But I suppose being the strongest soldiers, the Turks will do that to you. I jest, I jest. I not to insult any Bulgarians out there because I'm sure there's a few of you out there, but there is a very strange streak when you do get anti-Russian Bulgarians. Not that like these countries are obligated to be pro-Russia, but it's strange to see. And I'm not saying it goes this far, but Poland or Baltic states rhetoric about Russia out of Bulgaria, it just doesn't track. And no, maybe that shows my ignorance about the subject. But finally, we have Georgia, where the current president, uh, Kavashvili, says that the West pressured Tbilisi to open a quote-unquote second front in the Caucasus as the Ukraine conflict began, and that EU membership was EU candidacy, for that matter, was leveraged. U.S.-funded NGOs poured money to push Georgia back into war, and he said that yeah, they came to him with war plans, or they came to Georgia with war plans, and tried to get them to open that second front, which is something we talked about, especially when it came to the war in the Caucasus, that they wanted that second front, and the Caucasus was primed for that. But to move on, in Trump's words, to cover some East Asian news, in Trump's words, we have a great deal, referring to China. Now, as it stands now, after this complete debacle with Iran, it seems like a lot of U.S. diplomatic credibility is shot. So we'll see how much longer that great deal stays in place. But just a summary of the phone call between Trump and Xi Jinping over the past week is that the U.S. should remove all trade restrictions on China. Um, After the Geneva talks, Washington should handle the Taiwan issue with caution to avoid dangerous conflict between China and the U.S. It's important to quote unquote get rid of all obstacles to improve U.S. China relations. The Chinese president invited his U.S. counterpart to visit his country. Those were from Xi Jinping statements, and takeaways from Trump's statements is that U.S. leadership promised to announce the date and venue of the meeting with the Chinese president later. Trump also, in kind, invited Xi Jinping to the U.S., and that they agreed to hold bilateral ministerial level meetings on trade, and that the telephone conversation focused primarily on trade and did not discuss the issues involving Ukraine and Iran. And that is Trump touting that he has a great deal in the works with China. We'll see if that comes to fruition, but once again, when Trump came into office, I thought détente with China may have been on the table, and that they may have shifted towards Russia. Trump's foreign policy, even before he took office, was extremely hazy, so there were a lot of speculations going around there. And it looked like some of his plans would require a cooling of tensions with China. And we could see that. I doubt it at this point, like I said. I think that ship has sailed, and that diplomatic credibility for quite some time on the American part is shot. But getting into the situation in Korea with the presidential election, um, the newly elected South Korean president Lee Jae-myung has said that he intends to soften the hard line in North Korea set by the previous administration, and that the Democratic Party candidate was expected to diverge from former President Yoon Suk Yeol, the one who tried to stage the coup, policy on North Korea. And one of his first orders of business will be to attend a force posture review with top South Korean military decision makers. The topic of U.S. drawdowns of the Korean Peninsula will likely again be discussed as the Democratic Party has long espoused dialogue over the conflict with North Korea. Many South Korean politicians are aligned with Lee as they see a reduction in the U.S. force posture as a worthwhile concession if it smooths relations with North Korea. Which is interesting. It does, in some ways, align with Trump's goals. I'm sure Trump is sold on a third meeting with Kim Jong Un, which once again, after the debacle with Iran, I doubt he's going to get. But it also does shift with him wanting to reprioritize military assets. Now, what I thought would have been to the Asia Pacific, it looks like you're going to have to be to the Middle East. So we could see drawdowns on the Korean Peninsula in order to bolster the American presence in the Middle East in light of the newest conflict, as it were. And the last piece of news I will share with you out of East Asia and for the show is that Shoigu is scheduled to meet with Kim Jong Un to talk on the Ukraine crisis and Korean Peninsula tensions. And they also discussed cooperation across various sectors, according to the Russian embassy in North Korea. Now, mind you, Shoigu, former Minister of Defense, moved to a position in the Security Council, which, in many ways, in the Russian government, is a promotion that is really Putin's inner circle to sit on the Security Council. And Shoigu still does find himself in a very indispensable position, despite being outside the Ministry of Defense, and arguably a position that suits him much better. And what more can you say about this episode? This was one of the biggest ones we've had in a while. And I hope I did a good job covering all this. I know it's very hard to cover these developing situations, and like I said, I hope this isn't too stale by the time it comes out. Which, like I said, it'll be a 12-hour turnover by the time of end of recording and premiere of the episode. But I hope you guys enjoyed. I'll certainly keep you guys up to date and try to keep the episodes out a little more frequently. We'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.